Welcome to our presentation, the first one in our series on specific learning disorders. Tonight we'll be talking about specific learning disorders in reading, what parents and teachers should know. My name is Ocean, and today I'll be presenting alongside my colleagues Brittany and Claire. Before we dive into learning about specific learning disorders in reading, my colleagues and I would like to introduce ourselves. I'll start. As you already know, my name is Ocean. I'm a master's student in the School and Applied Child Psychology program at the University of Calgary. I'm currently researching the relationships between post-secondary students' use of self-regulated learning strategies, so things like time management and different ways of coping, their exercise frequency and intensity, and their perceived stress levels. Prior to moving to Alberta, I completed my Bachelor Arts Honors degree at the University of Regina. During this time, my primary research focused on understanding how conceptual knowledge of arithmetic develops in childhood. In addition to my research experience, I've been blessed with the opportunity to work with children and adolescents who have autism. I've spent 5 years working as an autism interventionist using applied behavioral analysis to help children and adolescents develop emotional regulation skills, social skills, and both receptive and expressive language skills. These combined experiences have inspired my journey towards becoming an educational psychologist.
Awesome. Now I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Brittany. I'm in the middle there. My computer is glitching, so I'm just going to take off my camera for the duration of this video. I'm also currently a Master's of Science student in the University of Calgary's Child and Applied School Psychology program. I previously completed my Bachelor of Arts at Carleton University in Ottawa with a specialization in child development. I've had the privilege to work with a diverse array of children over the last 10 years through working at various summer camps, coaching, nannying, providing remedial intervention, and through various placements. I have a passion for working with children with exceptional needs, and I love working one-on-one with students and parents to support them through this not-so-unique academic journey.
My name is Claire, and I'm currently a PhD student in the University of Calgary's School and Applied Child Psychology program. I completed my master's degree at the University of Calgary and my undergraduate degree at the University of Toronto. Over the last few years, I worked with a number of students through tutoring, volunteering in the kindergarten classroom, and working in a variety of research settings looking at child development. I have a passion for working with students to help them succeed socially, emotionally, and academically. I also enjoy working with teachers and parents to develop a plan of support.
Today, the main learning objectives or outcomes from our presentation are as follows. We want you to be able to understand the core components of a specific learning disorder in reading, acquire knowledge about the referral and testing process for psychoeducational assessments, as well as learn about specific evidence-based resources to help students, families, and school personnel teams navigate students' unique academic challenges. And just a reminder before we get into the content of our presentation, if you have any questions throughout, please drop them in the chat box, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll answer as many questions as possible. And then if your question isn't answered, just email it to CES. Now, without further ado, Brittany will define and explain what a specific learning disorder is.
A learning disorder is a neurological disorder that affects the way a person stores, understands, retrieves, and/or communicates information. An estimated 5 to 15% of school-age children struggle with a learning disorder. Learning disorders are invisible and lifelong. They can also occur alongside other disorders, for example, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and anxiety. It is crucial to understand that learning disorders are not the same as intellectual disabilities, indicating that intelligence is not a contributing factor to the difficulties experienced by those with a learning disorder. In fact, most students as other students their age. Their brains are simply just wired differently, and this difference affects how they receive and process information. Living with a learning disorder can have an ongoing impact on many things, including friendship, school, work, self-esteem, and daily life. However, people with learning disorders can succeed when coping skills and strategies are developed, and that's what we're here today to discuss. Now, one of the questions you're here to gather more information on today is, how is a learning disorder diagnosed? In the world of diagnoses, there are two divergent definitions of a learning disorder that can be used to assess students' academic difficulties. First is the DSM. This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. We now use the 5th edition. It states that a learning disorder is when an individual has difficulties learning and using academic skills that persist for at least 6 months, despite the provision of interventions that target those difficulties. The second the second definition we use is LDAC. This is the Learning Disabilities Association of Canada, and it indicates that learning disabilities refer to a number of disorders which may affect the acquisition, organization, retention, understanding, or use of verbal or nonverbal information. These disorders affect learning in individuals who otherwise demonstrate at least average abilities essential for thinking and/or reasoning. There are 3 specific learning disorders. They can be in reading, math, and written expression. It is not uncommon for a student to be diagnosed with more than one of these at a time. However, reading difficulties are the most prevalent, and that's where we intend to begin our presentation series today.
Did you know 80% of specific learning disorders are reading learning disorders?
A specific learning disorder in reading is characterized by inaccurate or slow and effortful word reading, having difficulty sounding out words, and/or having difficulties understanding the meaning of what is read. The different terminology often used by psychologists, teachers, clinicians, and researchers to describe reading problems can be very confusing. Psychologists often use the term specific learning disorder or specific learning disorder with an impairment in reading. Meanwhile, other professionals often use equivalent terms such as specific learning disability, reading disability, and decoding disability. These terms, including dyslexia, refer to the same condition of difficulty with word reading, spelling, and writing. The previous edition of the DSM states that dyslexia is an alternative term also used to refer to a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate or fluent word recognition, poor decoding, and poor spelling abilities. In order for us to understand difficulties in writing, it is first important for us to understand the 5 fundamental components of reading that every child needs in order to grow into a confident and fluent reader. These are vocab, fluency, phonemic awareness, phonics, and reading comprehension. We're going to begin with phonics. Phonics is the process of mapping the sounds in words to written letters. This is one of the earliest reading skills that children developed because it introduces them to the link between letters and sound. This is known as the alphabetic principle. An example of this would be the letter A. A makes that ah sound like an apple or animal. A lack of phonics instruction in early childhood can lead to reading difficulties further down the road. It is important that children can grasp the concept that printed text represents the sound of spoken words. The next core component is phonemic or phonological awareness. This is the ability to hear, identify, and manipulate individual units of sound, which are called phonemes. There are various levels of development in order to master phonological awareness. Phonological awareness is comprised of the 7 levels of development that are listed below here. We have identification of sound. This is simply knowing that the letter A makes the ah sound. The second stage is the ability to match sounds. For example, dog or door start with the same sound. The third stage is the student's ability to blend. This is putting together all the sounds of a word. For example, cat would be k, ah, t, to make cat. The fourth stage is segmentation. This is the ability to take apart a word into separate sounds. For example, the word check, to break it down into the 3 sounds, ch, ah, and ka. Sorry. The fifth stage is deletion. This is the ability to delete a sound from a word to create a new word. For example, take the word grain and say it without the G. We would now have rain. The sixth stage is addition. This is the ability to add a letter to a word to create a new word. For example, adding G to oat to make goat. And the final stage is substitution. This is being able to change letters to create a new word. For example, changing cat and replacing the C with an M. Now the new word would be mat. Children can develop phonemic awareness by learning about sounds, the phonemes, syllables, and words. It is one of the most fundamental skills children need to acquire in order to learn to read.
Did you know phonemic awareness is the best predictor of reading success?
Thanks, Ocean. And our next core component of reading is vocabulary. Having an ever-increasing vocabulary is a fundamental part of academic and reading success. The more words we know, the better we can become at reading and understanding the text that we read. Every child approaches reading with varying abilities. The larger a child's speaking and listening vocabulary, the more words they will be able to add to their reading and writing vocabs with relative ease. Some of the most fundamental words that a child will learn when starting to read are sight words. These include high-frequency sight words such as on, I, the, is, and be. The first 100 sight words make up more than 50% of most texts for early readers and are therefore extremely beneficial for your child to learn early on in their reading journey. The next core component of reading is fluency. Reading fluency is the ability to read with speed, accuracy, and prosody. Prosody is the use of pause, pitch, stress, volume, and temp in speech to convey information and the meaning of a sentence. In order to understand what children read, children must be able to read fluently when they are reading aloud or silently. There is a range of different skills that build reading fluency in young children. These include strong phonic decoding skills, an expanding bank of high-frequency words recognized at sight, and the amount of time that children spend reading books at an appropriate level. The more that children read, the better they are at understanding and reading with speed and accuracy. The final core component of reading is reading comprehension. This is the understanding and interpretation of what is read. To be able to accurately understand written material, children need to be able to 1. Decode what they've read, 2. Make connections between what they have read and what they already know, and 3. Think deeply about what they have read. Reading comprehension is a complex skill that requires time and practice to develop fully. Comprehension is a skill that will not only affect a child's future reading ability, but also their academic ability throughout school and beyond. Whew, that was a lot. So let's stop and reflect on what we just learned. We're going to be taking moments throughout our presentation to stop and review the key takeaways from each section because we will be giving you a lot of information today. So from the first section, it's important to remember there are alternative terms for specific learning disorders in reading, including specific learning disorder with an impairment in reading, specific learning disability, reading disability, decoding disability, and dyslexia. And as I went into detail, there are 5 different components of reading that are really important. Those are phonics, phonemic awareness, vocab, fluency, and reading comprehension. It is also important for us to remember that children who experience difficulties in one or more of the 5 areas of reading, despite receiving additional classroom supports, may have a diagnosable learning disorder in reading. Given that we now have an in-depth understanding of the core components of reading, Claire and Ocean will further explain the processing skills needed for reading.
Okay, so orthographic mapping is an individual's ability to recognize and understand visual representations of language in written form, such as recognizing specific letters. There are 3 areas that make up orthographic mapping. A student needs to have phonemic awareness, which Brittany talked about. This is attention to the sounds in the oral word. They need to also have attention to the details of the structure of the written word relative to the oral word, which is what we call word study. And they need that sound symbol skill, which is the proficiency with letters and sounds.
So now that we understand orthographic mapping, let's explore how those skills come together in decoding. Decoding is one of many foundational processes that occur while children or adults engage in reading. It's their ability to recognize specific graphemes. So those are individual letters within a word, and they do this via orthographical processing. This is then connected with phonemes, the speech sounds associated with each specific letter in a word, and this occurs via phonemic awareness. Once this connection is made between orthology and phonology, children blend the individual speech sounds together to pronounce words fluently. This skill is important for reading fluency. Next, we'll explore the different routes in our brain that information must travel through in order for us to read whole words or phrases. When presented with a word, in order to read it, our brains must use 3 different types of processing. We've already talked about each of them separately. They are orthographical, semantic, and sometimes phonological processing. Depending on which of these processes are used, different routes in our brains will be activated. Today, we'll explore 2 of these routes through our discussion of the dual route model of reading. This is one of many foundational theories and models that explain how the brain processes information in order to read. Dual route models emphasize the role of semantic processing in word reading. More specifically, they propose that a semantic system contributes to individuals' abilities to read. This system can be activated via 2 distinct routes, a direct route and an indirect route. The direct route is often activated when processing words that are familiar and frequent, or words that contain irregular mappings from morphology to morphology. Activation of the dual route of reading occurs when individuals see a word and they automatically start to use their orthographical processing skills to recognize the letters within the word. Then once this occurs, it immediately activates semantic processing, which allows individuals to understand the meaning of the word. When words are less familiar or more difficult, readers utilize a phonologically mediated route in which they activate first the phonological information and subsequently access a semantic representation from the phonology. So essentially, it goes from orthology to phonology to semantics. The phonological route can be compared to sounding out a word, as comprehension is thought to come from the sound rather than directly from the written orthographic representation. Children or students who have difficulties with reading often use this indirect route of processing. This makes reading more effortful and taxing if used for extended periods of time. All right, let's stop. Since that was a lot of information to process all at once, let's stop and reflect on what we've just learned. Orthographic mapping is the formation of letter-sound connection. Decoding is one's ability to identify letters within a word and match them with their corresponding speech sounds in order to pronounce words fluently. Semantic processing helps us comprehend and make sense of what we've read. And then according to the dual route model of reading, there are 2 routes of processing implicated in reading. A direct route, where individuals see a word and immediately know its meaning. An indirect route, where individuals see a word and recognize the letters, but then they need to sound them out via phonology before understanding the meaning of the word. Next, Claire will discuss some of the neurobiology of reading.
Okay, so we're just going to go briefly into the neurobiology of reading. The skills we just talked about are used by individuals who are able to efficiently engage in reading skills. However, some children and students have difficulty with reading, which can be based on impairments in underlying neural circuits in the brain. The inferior frontal cortex helps us form speech sounds. We use this area to think about pronouncing written words. The parietal temporal cortex helps us understand speech sounds and what words mean. We use this area for sounding out or decoding unfamiliar words. This, along with our inferior frontal cortex, works together in phonological processing. The occipital temporal cortex helps us recognize words by sight. As we recognize more words by sight, we can read faster, as Ocean discussed in the dual routes to reading. These 3 areas are involved in reading no matter which language people read in. And differences in these areas are found in the brains of people with a reading disorder. The inferior frontal cortex shows more activity in kids with a reading disorder compared to skilled readers. If we think about what this area does, it makes sense because kids who are having difficulty with reading are doing a lot of sounding out of the words. The parietal temporal and occipital temporal cortex shows less activity as individuals with reading difficulties may have a hard time understanding the sound structure of language and can have difficulty recognizing those sight words without sounding out. What is fascinating is that with intensive instruction, brain activity increases in key areas of the brain. So what does a learning disorder in reading look like? We'll go through some common difficulties that children with a learning disorder in reading experience at different developmental levels after we watch this video.
That was just a visual for us to see what someone with dyslexia sees when they read. Just gives us a glimpse into their eyes. But now we'll spend the next few minutes going through some common difficulties, like Claire mentioned, that children with learning disorder and reading experience at different developmental levels. It is first important to note that children who don't have learning disabilities may still experience some of these difficulties at various times. The time for concern is when there is a consistent unevenness in a child's ability to master certain skills. It is also very important to note that these lists do not constitute a diagnosis and does not replace professional consultation. So the first stage we're going to discuss today is the preschool years. Some visible signs and symptoms to look out for at this age include problems pronouncing words, children that often have difficulties rhyming words, for example, bat and cat. These students often will have trouble learning the alphabet, numbers, colors, shapes, or days of the week. Additionally, students with a learning disorder at this age may also have difficulty following directions or learning routines and have difficulty with fine motor skills, including controlling crayons, pencils, scissors, or coloring within the lines. The next stage is children's ages 5 to 9. These children may have trouble learning the connection between letters and sounds, along with challenges in blending, adding, and deleting sounds to make new words. In the classroom, students with a learning disorder in reading at this age may confuse basic words when reading, are slow to learn new skills, and consistently misspell words. Students ages 10 to 13 may exhibit difficulty with reading comprehension as the work expectations are much greater at this stage. These students often have trouble with open-ended test questions and word problems. Children at this age also often have poor handwriting, poor organizational skills, and have trouble following classroom discussions and expressing thoughts aloud. These students most frequently dislike reading and writing and therefore use avoidance strategies to get out of reading aloud or simply having to read and write. In adolescence, the signs and symptoms include extreme difficulty managing and keeping track of assignments and deadlines. These students often have anxiety around test taking and the use of avoidance strategies. Teachers may notice discrepancies between school performance and scores on a standardized test at this age, along with observing a student who requires to read and reread material in order to understand it. Reading at this level may appear very slow and laborious. In adulthood, a reading disorder may look like someone who often dislikes reading aloud, public speaking, or reading for pleasure. An adult with a learning disorder with an impairment in reading frequently has to reread sentences in order to comprehend, has uncertainty with words, punctuation, and spelling, has difficulty focusing when reading, and relies too heavily on spell check and grammar check. Again, let's take a minute to stop and reflect on what we just learned. As evidenced by the signs and symptoms just discussed, impairments in reading can look different at various developmental levels. Additionally, as reading demands and expectations progress based on grade level, students with difficulties in reading may experience more intense emotions and display more behaviors such as avoidance when asked to complete an activity that requires any reading abilities. If you suspect a learning disorder in your child or student, it is encouraged that you seek supports right away. So now, as parents and educators, our next question is, what do we do when we suspect a specific learning disorder in reading? If your child is having difficulty learning, the first step is to talk to the classroom teacher to determine what might be causing these difficulties and decide if there are any small changes that can be made that would improve the situation at school. Teachers can use a number of informal methods to identify learning needs, including talking with the child, observing the child in the classroom, analyzing the child's classwork, and doing an informal reading inventory, administering screening tests. Many districts have school-based teams that might include special education teachers, counselors, administrators, and regular classroom teachers who are very knowledgeable about learning difficulties and learning strategies. Teachers may consult with the team to develop strategies to address the learning needs of individual students. If it is apparent that school-based strategies aren't able to implement enough supports, the teachers, in consultation with the parents, will make a referral for a specialized assessment. Each school authority has different assessment procedures, so talk to your child's teacher or the school principal about what will take place and how long it will take. Alberta Education Standards for Special Education recommends that specialized assessments, including the written report, be completed within 8 weeks unless there are extenuating circumstances.
So as Brittany discussed, the first step if a child or adolescent is struggling to learn is to talk to school personnel. School personnel can put some supports in place without an assessment. However, if difficulties persist despite the help provided, an assessment can be requested. If an assessment cannot be completed in a timely manner, it can be completed by a psychologist in private practice. The website listed has a list of psychologists in Alberta. You could also search for psychologists in other cities that do psychoeducational assessments. Some resources in Calgary that do psychoeducational assessments are the Integrated Services in Education and CanLearn.
Since Claire thoroughly explained where to take your child for a psychoeducational assessment, I'm going to expand upon this by explaining a little bit more about what a psychoeducational assessment will typically look like. As parents and teachers, this process might seem a little bit daunting or even scary if you've never experienced it before. This is why we'll share more about it in order to help you become more familiar with what to expect from the psychoeducational assessment process. So you suspect that your child or student in your class has a learning disability. You've contacted the appropriate parties and initiated the referral process to investigate the matter further. Now, what comes next? The next step is the psychoeducational assessment. This is a special type of assessment where trained professionals investigate your child's or student's strengths, as well as their areas of difficulty. It's conducted in a holistic manner in which professionals aim to gain a cohesive understanding of your child or student's academic, social, emotional, and behavioral functioning across multiple domains, such as at home, at school, and within the community. This allows professionals to gather necessary information to determine the root cause of your child or student's difficulties. It also helps to inform recommendations or suggestions that can utilize your child or student's strengths to help enhance their skill set in areas that are personally challenging for him or her. A typical psychoeducational assessment consists of 4 primary parts shown here on this slide. There's typically an intake meeting, cognitive testing, academic testing, and then additional testing. Okay, first we'll discuss the intake meeting. There are typically 3 main parts to these sessions: informed consent and confidentiality, defining the referral question, and history taking. In terms of informed consent and confidentiality, all psychologists or psychologists in training, such as myself, who work in Alberta, are regulated by a governing body that creates specific guidelines and policies that must be adhered to. This ensures the best quality of care for clients, their families, and community members. These standards also ensure that clients are aware of their legal rights while accessing any type of psychological service, whether it's an assessment, a counseling session, or a consultation meeting. During an initial intake meeting, it is a psychologist's duty to discuss and obtain informed consent with their client. Throughout this process, psychologists will often present their clients with an informed consent form. Then they'll overview all the different rights to privacy that clients have, the special circumstances in which they'd have to breach confidentiality, and they'll also discuss the actual assessment process. For example, what's involved, the types of assessments they'd like to conduct, and what each of those assessments will investigate. They'll also seek your permission to conduct these assessments, as well as possibly conduct a classroom observation and interview your child's teachers and/or medical doctors. After this, the psychologist will provide parents with a chance to read and review the informed consent form and ask them to sign if they agree with everything that was discussed as it's written on the form. The following step of the intake meeting involves clarifying the purpose of the assessment. This is why parents and/or teachers are seeking the psychoeducational assessment for their child or student. At this point, a psychologist will verify the specific referral questions with parents. These questions are a way of specifically communicating what is being investigated during the assessment. Additionally, psychologists will also ask questions about what parents hope to gain from the psychoeducational assessment, whether that's supports and resources for their child, a specific diagnosis perhaps, a better understanding of their child's strengths and areas of difficulty maybe. After the referral questions are determined, the psychologist will proceed to the history-taking step. Throughout this step, the psychologist will ask questions about the child's developmental history, their cognitive, academic, and social, emotional, behavioral functioning across their lifespan, so from their birth until present time. And sometimes these questions will even involve information about the prenatal period. So if there was anything that happened during their mother's pregnancy that might have influenced their development. The psychologist will also ask specific questions pertaining to your child's behavior at home, at school, and within the community when he or she is partaking in a favorite activity, and then any differences in functioning when completing a non-preferred task. They'll also ask for examples of your child's strengths, and they'll seek to understand things that interest and motivate your child. This information will be used to make sure your child is as comfortable as possible during their initial testing sessions with the psychologist. The next step in the psychoed assessment process is one that most parents and teachers are aware of: cognitive testing. Most people view this as intelligence or IQ testing that provides information about how smart someone is. While this is a somewhat accurate depiction of cognitive assessments, it's important to understand a couple important details. First, the full-scale IQ quotient, which is what individuals are referring to when they discuss IQ, is a summary of an individual's ability to use 5 different types of cognitive processing. It's only one part of what we call an individual's cognitive profile. Second, an individual's cognitive profile is a depiction of his or her strengths and areas of challenge using specific types of cognitive reasoning or processing. And this type of information allows professionals to tailor specific recommendations and supports towards your child's or student's specific strengths to address his or her needs within the classroom, at home, or within the community. Now that we understand more about what cognitive assessments entail, let's briefly discuss the 5 types of cognitive reasoning or processing. So there's verbal reasoning, which is a child's ability to take in verbal information, use words to compare ideas, and explain what you know. Visual spatial reasoning. This helps individuals design, draw, build, and navigate their environment. Fluid reasoning is the ability to think about patterns, sequences, and quantities. Working memory is an individual's ability to hold simple auditory or visual information in their mind and manipulate it in order to determine an answer to a question. And finally, processing speed. This measures how quickly and accurately individuals can understand information to complete tasks. The next step in the psychoeducational assessment process is academic testing. This assessment will investigate your child or student's abilities across 3 primary domains: reading, writing, and mathematics. The specific areas of reading that are investigated are the same as the ones we discussed earlier in the presentation when talking about foundational skills for reading. As a refresher, those were phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, comprehension, and fluency. Since we've discussed them in detail earlier, we won't talk about them again. Instead, we'll briefly talk about the areas of writing and mathematics that are assessed during academic testing. Please keep in mind that your child's performance in each of these areas are assessed according to their grade level. Areas of writing that are evaluated are mechanics. This is your child or student's abilities to use proper spelling, capitalization, and punctuation. Writing fluency, how quickly and accurately your child or student can write simple sentences. Written expression, your child or student's ability to generate ideas, organize and structure their writing with things such as an introductory and concluding paragraph, as well as their abilities to use topic sentences to start paragraphs and transitioning sentences when moving from one paragraph to the next. These specific areas of writing will be discussed in more depth during next week's presentation, so be sure to check it out. Now let's talk about math. The areas of mathematics that will be explored are calculation, your child or student's ability to accurately and fluently complete different types of math questions, including things like square roots, place value, and fractions, if that's appropriate for their developmental level. Math fluency, your child or student's abilities to respond to basic math questions, including operations such as addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and being able to do this with both speed and accuracy. Applied problem solving, your child or student's ability to understand mathematical concepts and apply their computation skills while solving math word problems. All of these areas of mathematics will be discussed further 2 weeks from now in our presentation on specific learning disorders in mathematics. All right, so additional testing. This is sometimes required in order to rule out other potential diagnoses. Sometimes academic difficulties can be the result of underlying challenges in areas such as executive functioning, social, emotional, behavioral functioning, adaptive functioning, or issues using fine motor skills and visual motor integration, or even language processing. Let's explore these areas in more detail, starting with executive functioning. Executive functioning refers to a set of mental skills that work together to help direct, manage, regulate, and control a person's cognitions and behaviors towards achieving specific goals. It's important for initiating and planning tasks, maintaining attention, following multi-step directions, and remaining organized. In a school setting, difficulties with executive functioning can look like your child or student is experiencing challenges with starting their academic work or homework, they're having trouble listening to instructions, and they cannot remember more than one step when working on a multi-step task. They constantly misplace items in their desk, or they forget important school items such as their homework or backpacks at home. When applied specifically to reading, difficulties with executive functioning might impair students' abilities to focus their attention while trying to view and understand written words. Also, since there are multiple steps and processes involved in reading, their skills in this area might be impacted by their difficulties following multi-step directions. All right, let's move on to social, emotional, behavioral functioning. This refers to an individual's abilities to make and maintain relationships with others, such as friends, peers, and family, as well as their abilities to regulate their emotions and behaviors. These three areas of functioning are crucial for maintaining optimal mental well-being. If individuals experience difficulties managing their functioning in some or all of these areas, it can be indicative of things like mood disorders like anxiety or depression, or behavioral disorders such as intermittent explosive disorder or oppositional defiant disorder. In a classroom setting, anxiety might look like fear, anticipation, or worry about completing tasks involving reading. In young children and adolescents, this can also include avoiding reading tasks completely. And in younger children, they might become angry, upset, or frustrated when faced with a reading task that's extremely difficult for them. Depression, can sometimes appear if a student is uninterested or unmotivated about learning and or maintaining their social relationships with peers and friends. Students with these difficulties typically will find it difficult to start and complete academic tasks, and these issues will remain consistent across all tasks, regardless of if they're typically preferred or even unpreferred by the student. Intermittent explosive disorder can look like a behavioral meltdown in which a student has difficulty controlling their emotions, or he or she just starts yelling and crying uncontrollably for really no reason at all. And then oppositional defiant disorder can look like behavioral outbursts consisting of inappropriate behavior for the social environment. Sometimes it can manifest as extreme behaviors like ripping up worksheets, knocking over desks, or saying inappropriate things. And these behavioral outbursts will take away from opportunities to learn. Adaptive functioning. This refers to students' abilities to engage in everyday living tasks. These tasks are categorized within three domains: conceptual, social, and practical everyday living skills. Conceptual skills include communication, so speech, language, and listening skills that are needed to communicate with others. Functional academics, so these are things like basic reading, writing, and mathematics skills, such as telling time, measuring things, and writing notes. And these basic foundational academics are necessary for maintaining daily independent functioning. And then there's self-direction. These are skills required for independence, such as responsibility and self-control, initiating and completing tasks, keeping a schedule, following directions, or making choices. Social skills include leisure activities and socialization. These are skills required for interacting socially and getting along with others, which include having friends, showing and recognizing emotions, helping others, and using your manners. The last area of everyday living skills that are evaluated are practical skills. These skills include community use, so skills that include shopping and getting around the neighborhood that are necessary for functioning within society. Home living skills. These are skills needed for maintaining basic care of a home, living environment, or classroom, and they can include cleaning or performing chores. Another type of practical skill that is evaluated is health and safety, skills necessary for maintaining one's health and responding to illness or injury. These skills focus around being cautious, following safety rules as well. The final type of practical skill that is assessed is self-care. These are skills needed for personal care such as eating, dressing, bathing, and maintaining one's personal hygiene. If a student experiences marked difficulties across these three domains of daily living skills, it's likely that he or she will have trouble learning how to read, especially if he or she demonstrates difficulties understanding basic functional academic tasks. All right, so now let's talk about visual motor assessments. These assessments investigate students' abilities to both understand and use visual information to produce replications of specific geometric designs. Difficulties performing this type of task can manifest as difficulties with handwriting. So this could be issues with writing letters with proper form, and maybe not placing proper spacing between letters and words within written composition. And then we have brief language assessments that explore students' use of expressive, so verbal, and receptive, nonverbal language, such as pointing. These may be conducted to determine your student or child's understanding of basic vocabulary words or concepts. This is important as students experiencing difficulties comprehending and using language might struggle with subjects across the curriculum due to the extensive use of language required to listen to instructions, complete assignments, or respond to questions in class. Difficulties understanding language may present challenges for students who are learning to read, as they will likely have trouble understanding and demonstrating the sounds that specific letters make. All right, let's break all that information down a little bit and explore some of the key points that were just discussed. It's time to stop and reflect on what we've just learned. There are 4 primary parts in the psychoeducational assessment process: the intake meeting, cognitive testing, academic testing, and additional testing. Additional testing sometimes occurs in the areas of executive functioning, social emotional behavioral functioning, adaptive functioning, visual motor integration, and or language development. All psychoeducational testing is conducted to understand your child or student's academic profile. Psychologists are able to do this by using the different tests mentioned above to collect evidence of your child or student's strengths and areas of difficulty. This information is then used when determining which empirical recommendations will address your child or student's unique learning needs.
Thanks, Ocean, for thoroughly going through the assessment process. You all now might be wondering, why would a psychologist have to go through all of that testing for difficulties only presenting in reading? The reason additional testing is required is because approximately 30% of children with learning disabilities also have behavioral and emotional problems, which range from attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, being the most common, to depression, anxiety, suicide, and substance abuse, being the least common. Co-occurrence of such problems with specific learning disorder further adds to the academic difficulty that one may experience. It was also mentioned earlier that there are 3 specific learning disorders: reading, math, and written expression. Therefore, it is not uncommon for a student to be diagnosed with more than one of these at a time.
Okay, so after talking about what psychoeducational assessments look like, let's talk about how to understand these reports. There are a few measurement techniques used in psychoeducational reports that are norm-referenced and standardized to help understand the report. During the standardization process, the test is given to a large number of students from various backgrounds to determine what is average, low average, high average, etc. This allows us to compare a child's score to thousands of other students who are part of the normative sample. Norm references allows us to make statements such as, Johnny is doing as well as students his age. Norms can be reported as percentile ranks, which is on the bottom of this graph. A percentile rank of 60 corresponds to a performance that is as good as or better than 60% of one's same-aged peers. Average percentile ranks fall between 25 and 75. Standard scores also tells us about how well a student performed compared to their peers. Standard scores estimates whether a student's score are above average, average, or below average compared to peers. You might hear terms such as, Johnny is 1 standard deviation below the mean, which would be 90, as the average is set at 100 on most of our assessments. The further the score from the mean, the less likely you are to find the score in a group of individuals. Scores on the test is just part of the diagnosis process. A child or adolescent struggling in reading would be below average, usually below 2 standard deviations from the mean, in the extremely low to low range on this graph. So this is an example of an assessment done with a grade 3 girl who I called Sam for de-identification purposes. For her cognitive assessment, she had scores in the low average to average range, so we would expect her academic scores to be around the low average to average range. However, we can see she is struggling quite a bit with some reading skills, specifically oral reading fluency and reading comprehension, which brings her in the 2nd percentile. Looking on the graph, that would be on the left side, 3 standard deviations below the mean. At school, Sam is still working on sounding out small words, so her early reading skills are in the low average range. It is when she puts all of these early reading skills together to form sentences that it gets kind of muddy. Sam was diagnosed with a moderate reading disorder affecting reading fluency and reading comprehension. Recommendations included developing stronger early reading skills and sight word vocabulary before moving on to those more complex skills in reading.
Thanks for that thorough insight into how to understand the psychoeducational report, Claire. Now we'll talk more about how psychologists take that information, like those standard scores and behavioral observations, into account when going through the diagnostic decision-making process. This diagnostic decision-making process begins once a psychologist receives your case file. This information will guide the questions they ask at an intake meeting. Then, based on the information gathered at the meeting, psychologists will determine potential diagnoses that are important to explore in order to gain a comprehensive understanding of how your child or student functions at home, at school, and within the community. During this process, the psychologist will remain cognizant of his or her biases to ensure that he or she does not arbitrarily rule out potential diagnoses that could be important to query, and also ensure that he or she does not immediately jump to conclusions. For example, assuming that because a child or student has difficulties with reading, it must be a specific learning disorder with impairment in that area, when difficulties with executive functioning or even sometimes social emotional behavioral regulation could be potential factors resulting in this child or student's current presentation. All right, so moving on to the second step. This is where we list all possible diagnoses being queried, and this will guide the specific assessments that are chosen. Through these assessments, the psychologist will gather information, which we refer to as evidence. This evidence will be used during steps 3 and 4, when psychologists start to formulate evidence-based opinions regarding the potential underlying causes of a child or student's current presentation or difficulties. As evidence is collected throughout testing, this will lead to changes or potential shifts in the psychologist's educated opinion. In step 3, the psychologist will critically evaluate all the evidence from testing, including both students' responses to questions as well as their behavior across domains, in order to comprehensively understand how your child or student is functioning each day in multiple environments. This information will help the psychologist determine which of the hypothesized difficulties do not accurately explain the challenges your child or student is experiencing, and these conditions will be ruled out. Common conditions that are ruled out while exploring a student's academic difficulties in reading are intellectual disabilities. We want to understand your child's strengths and areas of difficulties with different types of reasoning. As sometimes students can have trouble completing their academic work. ADHD or other disorders that typically cause impairments in executive functioning are important to rule out because these difficulties can interfere with children's abilities to attend to both visual and auditory stimuli, initiate or plan tasks, and remain organized, which can in turn affect their academic performance. And then we also want to rule out potential social, emotional, and behavioral conditions such as depression, anxiety, or oppositional defiant disorders, as these conditions can also impact students' performance in the classroom through that lack of motivation, that fear or avoidance of completing specific tasks, sometimes even fear of writing exams, or even those behavioral outbursts that might take away time meant for learning and completing academic work. And then language processing disorders should be investigated if children have difficulties understanding verbal or receptive information, as this can also lead to academic challenges, since most Coursework is heavily dependent upon understanding language. Following this process, in step number 4, the psychologist will review gathered evidence to determine if there's enough information to support diagnosing any of the remaining conditions that are hypothesized. Sometimes there is sufficient evidence to make one or more diagnoses. Other times, the information collected does not align with criteria within the DSM or LDAC. As a result, it is inappropriate to provide a diagnosis.
So when a child is diagnosed with a learning disorder or disability in reading, a code is given by the school. The special education coding outlines criteria within specific categories to assist teachers and administrators to identify children and students who require additional supports in their educational program. Each category is given a code for the purpose of reporting special education data to Alberta Education. The need for additional supports may be determined at any time during the school year. It is the responsibility of school authority staff to assign a special education code to a student, which is based on documentation to support the assignment of a special education code. This includes a diagnosis of a disability or disorder by a qualified professional. In addition to this diagnosis, it is essential to have a clear indication of how the disability or disorder impacts the student's participation in learning in an educational environment. An assessment is designed to offer guidance to school authorities regarding Alberta Education's expectations for assessment practices and is done by psychologists in assessment for a learning disorder or disability. The code allows schools to ensure appropriate interventions of specific skill instruction, accommodations, strategies, and self-advocacy skills. We'll go into some specific recommendations later on. All right, so let's stop and reflect on what we just learned. The standardized testing ensures that comparisons can be drawn between a child and similar aged peers. Percentile scores are presented on a standardized distribution, also known as the bell curve. There are 4 main steps in diagnostic decision-making that Ocean discussed, and students diagnosed with a learning disorder are given a code by the school, which helps with providing supports. All right, so we're going to go over some recommendations and suggestions. This may be familiar or maybe a review. We're going to start with the foundational recommendations in reading and work our way through more complex processing in reading, such as fluency and comprehension. These are not exhaustive, but just some of the recommendations that you would most often start with. So phonics is the process of mapping the sounds in words to written letter. The best way for learners to learn phonics is through paired association learning. When learners create or are provided with concrete, meaningful, interactive, and imaginable connections that link the stimulus and response terms in memory. Integrating visual picture cues with phonics patterns enhances learners' visual acuity, prompting more immediate recognition of these complex patterns in text. The science behind auditory phonics instructions is that auditory pathways are activated by sound and engage when listening or talking. This skill is critical in separating the sounds of speech into distinct units for comprehension. This is why there is often recommendations for the student to listen to auditory stories or learn through songs and retelling of stories. Learning to read kinesthetically is taking advantage of muscle memory as a point for learning. Children learn by touching and doing, particularly those at the earliest grade levels. And then analogy phonics is when you teach students unfamiliar words by analogy to known words such as reading brick by recognizing that ick is contained in the known word kick. or reading stump by analogy to jump.
Short vowel A says ah like apple, ah, ah, ah. And long vowel A says A like gate, A, A, A. B says B like ball, B, B, B. C says K like cat, K, K, K. D says D like dog, D, D, D. Short vowel E says E like egg, E, E, E. And long vowel E says E like Pete, E, E, E. F says F like fish, F, F, F. G says G like goat, G, G, G. H says H like house, H, H, H. Short vowel I says I like igloo, I, I, I. And long vowel I says I like bike, I, I. J says J like jump rope, J, J, J. K says K like kite, K, K, K. L says L like leaf, L, L, L. M says like magnet, M. N says N like nest, N, N, N. Short vowel O says ah like ostrich, ah, ah, ah. And long vowel O says O like rope, O, O, O. P says P like pumpkin, P, P, P. Q says Qu like queen, Qu, Qu, Qu. R says like rabbit, R. S says S like sun, S, S, S. T says T like tiger, T, T, T. Short vowel U says like umbrella, And long vowel U says U like mule, U. V says V like vest, V, V, V. W says W like watch, W, W, W. X says X like x-ray, X, X, X. Y says Y like yo-yo, Y, Y, Y. Z says Z like zebra, Z, Z, Z.
All right, so phonological awareness and phonemic awareness is one of the best predictors of reading later on. And so creating a solid foundation in both phonological and phonemic awareness is important. There are 3 evidence-based strategies that help students learn phonological awareness, and that is only focusing on 1 or 2 phonological skills at a time, providing letters when teaching, for example, using a sound card or word blocks, and providing these instructions in small groups or one-on-one. There are a few word strategies to teach once the student has learned some of these basic reading skills. And it's important to model these strategies, demonstrate and provide opportunities for guided practice on these word-solving strategies. Just like when we teach 1 or 2 phonological awareness skills, we also teach 1 or 2 word-solving strategies at the same time.
Brittany, Ocean, are you there?
Oops, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Let's talk about vocabulary recommendations now. We want to practice memorizing and rehearsing high-frequency words. These are words that are some of the most common ones that occur in the English language. They're often abstract, they lack meaning, and they serve as function words within a sentence. For example, they're words like the, of, and with. We want to present these high-frequency words in context, so within sentences, so that students can become familiar with what the words actually mean. And then we also want to practice them in isolation. So this means by practicing them by themselves. This can be done using flashcards. It might be a good way to do this might be to create a word box using something like a recipe box with letter tabs. Have your child or student write each high-frequency word on a recipe card, then ask them to read those words out loud. Organize the cards in the box according to their levels of mastery once you're done practicing. Those levels of mastery can include words that they know well, words that are new to them, words they're reviewing, and then words that they are having problems with. Continue to practice reviewing the words and then shuffle them into their proper categories after each practice session.
Next, we're going to lead into fluency recommendations. As we know, reading fluency is the ability to read with speed, accuracy, and prosody. Reading aloud to children to provide a model of fluent reading is strongly encouraged, along with echo reading or choral reading. Echo reading is where the teacher or the parent will read, then the students will repeat that phrase back to them, while choral reading is where the teacher and the students read the passage at the same time. It is also recommended to have children listen and follow along with audio recordings, practice sight words using playful activities, and make use of students' personal interest in choosing books and materials. Reading comprehension recommendations. To refresh your memory, reading comprehension is the understanding and interpretation of what is read. Some suggestions include teaching thinking strategies to your students, encouraging reciprocal teaching, improving students' word knowledge, and to promote self-monitoring. Teachers can instruct students on cognitive strategies that they can use, such as discussing or activating prior knowledge, developing questions while reading, connecting what they're reading to another text, something they've seen, or something they've experienced. Other thinking strategies include visualizing or picturing what the students are reading, making predictions about what will come next in the text, looking back for key words, and rereading in order to clarify or answer questions in the text. Another recommendation is reciprocal teaching. This is when students take on a leadership role in their learning and begin to think about their thought process while listening or reading. Having children play different roles such as the questioner, the summarizer, the clarifier, and the predictor helps to ensure their comprehension of what is being read. Improving word knowledge in students can be done by encouraging students to relate what they do know to what they are reading by asking why questions about factual knowledge in the text. And finally, it's recommended for students to monitor their own comprehension, noting explicitly whether decoded words make sense to them and whether the text itself makes sense to them. When problems are detected, students should know that they need to reprocess, so this may be going back into what they read and rereading it again to fully understand.
So we talked about a lot today, and so some key takeaways are that we must be aware of the multiple terms for a specific learning disorder in reading. Sometimes this is called a learning disability, specific learning disorder, or dyslexia. Difficulties in one or more of the 5 areas of reading, despite supports in the classroom, may indicate a learning disorder in reading. So we want to be aware of this in the classroom. There are also specific cortical areas in the brain that helps us form speech sounds, understand speech sounds, and helps us to recognize sight words. The activity in this area is different in children with reading challenges. Next, every child's learning profile is different, so we tailor supports and recommendations. This is done through a comprehensive psychoeducational assessment. Students with a learning disorder in reading will receive a special education code, and this code ensures that students will receive supports throughout their education through an individualized program plan.
And that concludes our presentation. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to us today. Our presentation and an additional resource page has been provided at the link when you signed in. We are also open to answer any questions you may have from our presentation. And if we're unable to answer your question today, please for our presentation on reading disorders with an impairment in written expression, where we will begin with the recap from today's presentation.
Thank you, Ocean, Claire, and Brittany. A question just came in. How often should you have a psychoeducational assessment completed?
Hi. Typically, the psychoeducational assessment, they are redone every few years or so, depending on your child's development, especially when they're transitioning from like middle school to high school or from like high school to post-secondary during those huge transition years. That's because the presentation of a specific learning disorder can be rather fluid over time. So if your student initially is struggling in one area of reading and then you implement a bunch of suggestions and recommendations for them, it might help them be able to cope with those skills over time, and then they'll be able to better deal with their difficulties. So at a time in the future, you might want to have them reassess to see if there's any other recommendations that might be more beneficial to them at the level they're currently at.